You ever feel like the news is just giving you whiplash?
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
Like, one minute we're hearing about amazing economic growth, charts are up.
Records breaking.
Exactly. And the next minute, you see these heartbreaking pictures of, polar bears on shrinking ice. It's just this constant back and forth.
It really is. We want things to be better for people, which, well, usually means economic growth, doesn't it?
Right. But then it feels like the planet sends us the bill for that growth.
Mm.
Honestly, sometimes I just want to hide under the covers, maybe with some chocolate. Sustainably sourced, of course.
Well, you're not alone there.
Yeah,
And I bet, like us, you've probably thought, there's got to be a smarter way to think about all this, right?
absolutely. So, for this deep dive, we're not just going to rehash the usual arguments. Is green growth possible? Is degrowth the only way?
No, we wanted to go a bit deeper,
Hmm.
based on these sources you shared, and look at a really interesting shift in perspective.
Yeah, the goal today really is to help you, our listener, get your head around moving from being, well, totally hooked on economic growth.
To becoming what we could call growth agnostic.
Growth agnostic. Okay,
Yeah.
sounds intriguing, maybe a little philosophical. What does it actually mean, though, for how we see the world, maybe the choices we make?
That's exactly what we want to unpack.
Yeah.
We've got some fascinating material here looking at economic ideas and the big environmental challenges we face.
And we're really trying to pull out the practical stuff, things you can actually use, maybe apply to how you think about things.
Okay, so let's start with this core problem the author lays out. They call it the growth conundrum,
Right.
and it's summed up in this one quote. It's pretty powerful. No country has ever ended human deprivation without a growing economy,
Okay, makes sense.
and no country has ever ended ecological degradation with one.
Oof. Okay, yeah, let's sit with that for a second. That really puts it starkly, doesn't it?
It does.
Especially when you think about that ideal, the Doughnut Model, right? Meeting everyone's needs.
Within the planet's limits,
Yeah.
yeah. It highlights the tightrope we're walking.
So how does growth agnosticism fit in here? What's the idea?
Well, the core idea is about deliberately designing our economies so that human prosperity, our well-being, isn't just automatically tied to whether GDP goes up or down or stays flat.
So it's not like anti-growth necessarily, or just ignoring the economy.
No, not at all. It's more about not depending on endless growth as the only way to solve problems or improve lives. The author makes this point that we've kind of developed a societal addiction to it.
An addiction? How so?
Our whole system, finance, politics, even just our expectations, are all sort of built around this idea that the economy must keep expanding. We expect it, we demand it.
Which does make you wonder, why is that? Why is this constant upward line, this graph going up forever, such a deep-seated assumption? Like, we can't imagine a good future without it.
It's funny you mentioned the graph. The book points out something quite revealing. If you ask an economist to, draw the long-term future of economic growth,
They draw that hockey stick curve going up.
probably an exponential curve, yeah. But here's the kicker. You almost never see those kinds of long-term, multi-century projections in actual economics textbooks.
Really? Why not?
The author suggests it's almost too dangerous to draw
Whoa.
because it forces economists, and really all of us, to confront these really deep, often unexamined beliefs about endless expansion. It challenges the whole foundation.
Too dangerous to draw. That's quite something. It makes you think about those hidden assumptions we just carry around.
Exactly. Because, earlier economic thinkers actually had a different picture in mind. They talked about the S-curve of growth.
The S-curve, like it
Yeah.
levels off.
Precisely. Like how a person grows, right?
Yeah.
You grow quickly as a child, then you reach adulthood, and you level off. You don't just keep getting taller forever.
Okay, that makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, a Belgian mathematician, Pierre Verhulst, used this S-curve way back in the 1830s, actually. He used it for population growth, showing it naturally reaches limits. It doesn't just explode infinitely.
So the idea was that economies might follow a similar pattern. They grow, they mature.
And then potentially stabilize.
Yeah.
There have to be limits,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Resource limits, maybe even limits to how much stuff we actually need or want.
Right.
And here's the really crucial point. Even if that overall economic expansion, the GDP growth, slows down or stops, thriving can continue.
Thriving can continue. How?
Think about nature. A mature rainforest isn't constantly expanding its area, but it's incredibly complex, vibrant, resilient, or a healthy adult human body.
Right. They're not growing bigger, but they're functioning, living.
Exactly. They can flourish for a long, long time if the conditions are right. The suggestion is maybe our economies could aim for that kind of mature, stable flourishing, managed wisely, rather than just endless expansion.
That feels a lot healthier, actually. More sustainable than just constant pressure. So, okay, what about this idea of decoupling then? You hear that a lot. Can we just innovate our way out, grow the economy, but use fewer resources?
Ah, the decoupling debate, yes. This is where things get, well, let's say, debated. The book frames it really well, actually, with two perspectives. You've got the keep on flying camp.
Keep on flying, like an airplane that just keeps climbing.
Pretty much. They believe, fundamentally, that continued growth is necessary, and it's possible we can achieve it through technology, efficiency, basically decoupling economic activity from its environmental impact.
So, using less energy, fewer materials, producing less waste, even while the economy gets bigger.
Exactly. Specifically, absolute decoupling, where total resource use actually goes down, even as GDP goes up.
Is there any proof this is happening? Can we actually do that?
Well, there is some evidence. The book mentions that in some high-income countries, places like Germany, the UK, the US, between roughly 2000 and 2013, they did see their consumption-based CO2 emissions go down a bit while their economies still grew. So some absolute decoupling of carbon, at least.
Okay, so maybe the keep on flying folks have a point. It can happen.
Well, hold on. Then you have the other perspective, the prepare for landing camp.
Prepare for landing. Okay, I see where this is going.
Right. They look at the same data and say, well, first, many other rich countries haven't managed that absolute decoupling of carbon. And second, even where it has happened, is it happening fast enough?
Fast enough to, like, meet climate goals, stay within those planetary boundaries.
Exactly. Their argument is that relying solely on decoupling is a huge gamble. It might be too little, too late, and maybe the kind of drastic action we actually need to take for the environment might make constant economic growth pretty unrealistic anyway, at least in those high-income countries.
So it's like hoping the engineers invent a magic fuel source just as the plane's running out of runway.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. It's a risk assessment, really.
Okay, so if decoupling isn't a guaranteed fix, why is it so hard to imagine, let alone create, an economy that doesn't need constant growth? The book talks about this lock-in. What does that actually mean for us?
Lock-in is about how deeply that expectation of growth is just built into everything. Think about our financial systems. How do investors make money?
Interest, dividends, profits.
Right. Which generally rely on companies growing, selling more, becoming more valuable in economic terms. Businesses themselves, their main goal is often increasing profit, market share.
Which usually means growing.
Usually.
Yeah.
And governments. They rely on tax revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
More economic activity, more jobs, more income.
Mm.
Generally means more taxes collected to fund public services.
So the whole system is kind of geared towards wanting, needing, expecting that growth number to go up. Like a treadmill we can't easily step off.
Exactly. And this can lead to, well, maybe not the best long-term decisions. The author gives this example. A government might be tempted to go for, say, cheap fossil fuels because it boosts the economy now, rather than making bigger, maybe slower investments in clean energy that are better for the future.
Right. The short-term gain wins out over the long-term necessity. The sugar rush versus actual health.
Precisely.
Okay, this is starting to feel a bit heavy. If we're so locked into this growth thing, how do we even begin to think about shifting towards being growth agnostic? Are there practical ideas, things we can actually do?
Yeah, absolutely. And the book uses this nice analogy. Remember economists talking about the preconditions for takeoff for economic growth?
Vaguely, yeah. Things needed to get growth started.
Right. So the idea here is that preparing for a landing, or maybe just stable cruising altitude, means we need to consciously redesign the very structures that made that endless growth seem normal or necessary. The financial system, political incentives, even our social habits.
So it's not just minor tweaks, it's looking at the actual foundations.
Exactly. Learning how to land the plane, as the author puts it. Creating economies that can thrive, provide for people, without demanding constant expansion. They mention economies Peter Victor's question, which I think is great. Can we go slower by design, not disaster?
By design, not disaster. I like that. So intentionally shaping things.
Yeah, shaping economies that can handle growth if it occurs naturally, but aren't desperately dependent on it.
Okay, so let's get down to brass tacks then. What could some of those design changes actually look like? How might things be different?
Well, the book explores some really interesting ideas, especially around finance. One is pretty radical. A demirage-bearing currency.
Demirage? What's that?
Okay, imagine if holding money, just letting cash sit there, actually had a small cost associated with it, like a tiny negative interest rate.
Wait, so my money would shrink slightly if I didn't use it or invest it?
That's the basic idea, yeah.
Hmm.
It sounds weird, but the thinking is it would discourage just hoarding wealth and instead strongly incentivize putting that money to work in productive, maybe regenerative ways.
Like investing in reforestation or sustainable businesses, things that maintain value over time.
Exactly. Banks might become less focused on just maximizing short-term financial return and more interested in funding projects with strong social or ecological benefits because just sitting on cash would be, well, costly. It flips the incentive away from endless accumulation.
Wow. Okay, that is a fundamental shift. What about jobs, though? That's always the big worry, isn't it? If the economy doesn't grow, where do the jobs come from?
That's a crucial question. The book mentions a couple approaches. One is rethinking the work week, maybe shorter hours.
Like a 4-day week.
Could be. Or just generally sharing the available work more. The book notes that worker-owned cooperatives, historically, have often chosen to reduce hours for everyone during hard times rather than laying people off.
Interesting. So sharing the work instead of cutting people loose.
Right. Another big idea is shifting taxes. What if we tax things we want less of, like resource depletion and pollution, much more heavily?
And tax things we want more of, like human labor, much less.
Exactly. Taxing resources and waste instead of income and payroll. That could make repairing things, reusing materials, remanufacturing,
Huh.
all much more economically attractive.
Because those activities often use more labor but fewer raw materials.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So you could potentially create more jobs in repair, maintenance, local crafts, while reducing our overall environmental footprint. It's a neat idea.
That is a clever switch up.
Huh.
Okay, so we've talked finance, jobs. What about the social side? This addiction you mentioned, the consumerism.
Yeah, the book definitely dives into that. It brings up Edward Bernays, who was pretty influential in shaping modern consumer culture, linking products to desires, identity.
Little retail therapy thing, buying stuff to feel good or to project a certain image. We're all surrounded by that messaging constantly.
We really are. And while some places have tried things like banning certain types of advertising, now we have super targeted online ads following us everywhere. It's relentless.
So how do we counter that?
Well, the book asks a really profound question, kind of channeling Bernays. If people aren't chasing the next purchase, what deep human values could take its place? What truly provides that sense of meaning and connection?
That hits deep because if buying stuff is just filling a hole, we need to ask what that hole actually is, right?
Right. And there's a fascinating idea from psychoanalyst Adam Phillips mentioned. Maybe our excesses, our endless wanting, are actually signs of some hidden deprivation.
Deprivation, like what are we missing?
Maybe meaningful relationships, a connection to community, to nature, to the living world around us, things that aren't about material wealth.
That resonates. So the alternative isn't just nothing. It's about focusing on other things that actually make life good.
Exactly. And the book points to work by the New Economics Foundation. There are 5 ways to well-being. Remember those.
Vaguely. Connect.
Connect with others, be active, take notice of the world, keep learning, and give back.
Right. Connect. Be active. Take notice. Learn. Give.
Yeah. None of those are about buying more stuff. They're about experiences, relationships, engagement. Maybe those could be our new aspirations.
That feels like a much healthier foundation for, well, everything. For us. For the planet.
And the book even offers a new metaphor for the economy. Forget the airplane that has to keep climbing or it crashes.
Okay, what's the new metaphor?
Think of a kite surfer.
A kite surfer. How does that work?
Well, a kite surfer isn't just going straight up. They're constantly adjusting, right? Responding to the wind, the waves, finding this dynamic balance.
Okay. Yeah. It's flexible, agile.
Exactly. So maybe GDP in a growth-agnostic economy is more like that kite surfer. It bobs, it dips, it responds to different forces, policy changes, ecological needs, social priorities, without this rigid obsession that it must only go up.
I like that image. It feels much more adaptable, more alive than a clunky airplane.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And one final point the book really stresses is the need to rethink economics education itself.
Back to the textbooks, or lack thereof.
Right. There's this growing movement, students saying, hey, what we're learning feels too narrow. It's not equipping us for the world we actually live in.
Yeah, you hear about groups like Rethinking Economics.
Exactly. And the author encourages all of us, you the listener included, to be really mindful of the underlying pictures and assumptions in economic discussions. Those fundamental ideas can go in deep without us even realizing it.
It's a good reminder that we all actually live in the economy. We have experiences, we see things, we have our own built-in sort of reality check.
You absolutely do. You have a rich bank of knowledge to sense check the theories. And the book really ends on this note of economic evolution. Change doesn't just come from grand theories.
It comes from people doing things differently.
Yes. Innovators trying new business models, building collaborative commons, experimenting with local currencies, designing regenerative products. It's happening already, piece by piece. It mentions Donella Meadows and her idea of leverage points.
Oh, yeah. The idea that some changes have much bigger ripple effects than others.
Right. And maybe tweaking prices or taxes is low leverage compared to, say, fundamentally changes the goal of the system away from just GDP growth or changing the feedback loops.
So it's about understanding the whole system, the dynamics.
Getting the beat of it, as Meadows said, before you jump in and try to change things, understand how it works, how we got here, what's still working well that we can build on.
So approach it with a bit of humility, maybe, and
Right.
curiosity.
Humility and a willingness to experiment, definitely.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it really feels like moving away from just chasing GDP opens up a much richer, more realistic way to think about prosperity, about how we can actually thrive, all of us, within the planet's means.
Absolutely. And this growth agnosticism, it's not about pessimism. It's about being smarter, more adaptable, more intentional about what kind of future we're building.
And we touched on some really concrete possibilities, different ways to handle money, different ways to think about work and value, and crucially, focusing on those deeper human needs beyond just, more stuff.
So maybe a final thought for everyone listening to mull over. Think about your own life.
Mhm.
Is there one area where that relentless pressure for more money, more things, more status feels strongest? And what tiny shift, what small experiment could you try to move towards something that feels more like genuine, sustainable well-being instead?
A great question to leave us with, something to explore for ourselves.